It came by the house the other day. Anybody need an outline tonight? Anybody need an outline? Glad to see everybody. Be opening over here. Opening to Genesis 20. 20 and 21. I got a little ambitious and decided we hit 2 chapters tonight. Chapter 20 is not a, well, it's similar to some events in chapter 12 with Abraham and Sarah. So we won't spend a great deal of time in chapter 20. We will spend more time in 21. All right. You have the account here of Abraham in southern Israel, journeyed from there to the south, between Kadesh and Shur, and sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said to Sarah his wife, and Abraham said of Sarah his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. So this is the second time this has occurred. The first time this occurred in Egypt. And the way I put it in your outline here, your first blank, this is the third time Abraham and Sarah have taken things into their own hands. So I don't know exactly the cultural significance, implications, whatever you want to say, of Abraham traveling to these different places and finding it necessary to say, she's my sister. You know why? I mean, I know why he did it. He tells us why he did it. Because if they know you're my wife, they'll kill me and they'll take you. But, you know, I'm reading through 6 commentaries as I'm doing this study, and I haven't really found it, 7 commentaries actually. I haven't found anything really that keys me in on exactly why or what the cultural significance is, except, well, these guys are kings and they can do what they want. Yes? Okay. It's interesting to read these accounts. I mean, he lied. And both here and in Egypt, people suffer because of it. Pharaoh and now Abimelech. Well, if it were just his sister, I would think, well, she doesn't belong to anybody. They wouldn't have to kill anybody. If she has a husband, he might be a problem. Especially, you know, with Abraham. Okay, so just for instance, if you remember, when he went back to recover Lot after he and his family and stuff had been kidnapped, Abraham had 318 soldiers under his command. So he's kind of like, when we were looking at that chapters 13 and 14, he's kind of like he was like a little bit of a king, had his own little army, you might say. But this is still the third time that Abraham and Sarah have taken things in their own hands. And the word I chose to use here is subterfuge. He practiced subterfuge, deceit used in order to achieve one's goal. That's what he tried to do. And as you read through the text all the way down through verse 13, you see that, again, there were consequences to Abimelech for taking Sarah. We don't know exactly what they were. We'll talk about it in just a minute, but we're introduced to these events here. Verses 3 to 13, Abimelech, God, and Abraham. So it's interesting because in verse 3, to whom does God speak? Doesn't speak to Abraham here, does he? He speaks to this pagan king, Abimelech. I was just looking back at Genesis chapter 12, where we have the first account of this. They had gone to Egypt because of famine, and they do the same thing there. Pharaoh saw her, the the princes of Pharaoh saw her and commended her to Pharaoh. And they took her, and he entreated Abraham well for her sake. But then the Lord plagued Pharaoh, Genesis 12 and verse 17. But here you have a direct communication from God to Abimelech himself. Yes? Close to 100. Because, well, he would be 100, she'd be 90. Because chapter 21, of course, is the birth of Isaac. Well, like I said, what I've been reading myself, I've not really seen anything to help me appreciate the significance of what's going on here. I'm sure there's some stuff out there. I just, frankly, haven't looked for it much. Outside of what I've been reading, that is. Okay, so God comes to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, Behold, thou art but a dead man for the woman which thou hast taken. For the woman which thou hast taken, for she is a man's wife. And it's interesting because you look at verse 4, his response. Lord, wilt thou slay also a righteous nation? And so I put that in your outline here. Had he heard about Sodom? Because the emphasis is, will you slay a righteous nation? We know what you did to Sodom, and then again, I could be reading into it there, but this is in southern Canaan, which is in the region of Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain. But whatever the case may be, he asks a question. And you will notice, so as we've been reading these early chapters of Genesis, one thing that we've noticed is when we're dealing with God's people, Abraham, Sarah, etc., you see the word Lord, it's typically Jehovah, the capital, all capital letters, Yahweh. And here, when Abimelech addresses him, it's not. It's more like Sir, or, a term of respect, but not identifying or not recognizing God as Jehovah God. Just an interesting note to me. And so he basically, I won't say he argues with God, but he says, this is what happened. He told me, she is my sister. And she herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and innocency of my hands have I done this. And God said, I know you've done this in the integrity of thine heart. But then you have this phrase, which I find very interesting. For I also withheld thee from sinning against me. Sinning against me. When I hear that, I think of Joseph in Genesis chapter 39, when Potiphar's wife presents herself to him, or offers herself to him. He said, how can I do this terrible thing and sin against God? Well, so here, I also withheld thee from sinning against me. Therefore, suffered I thee not to touch her. Well, how did he do that? I don't know. But God did something. Intervened in some fashion. You look down at verse 17. Abraham prayed unto God, and God healed Abimelech and his wife. So they were stricken with something. And if you remember back up in verse 3, God told him in that dream, you're a dead man. Did he strike him in that moment? I don't know. There are questions that frankly aren't answered by the text, but something happened. Something happened in the sense of God did not permit Abimelech to touch her, and then something happened in the sense of he struck Abimelech and his wife, and what else does it say? And his maidservants. So, somebody asked, do you think Sarah had any say in the matter? Well, it seems to me that she was, to me it's similar to what happened in Egypt. She agreed to it, so far as I can tell. And it was for the preservation of Abraham's life. Yeah. Yeah. That's Abimelech answering God, isn't it, there in verse 5. She is my sister, and even she herself said, he is my brother. So they were in on it together, you might say. Whatever the case may be, in some manner, God intervened. Could be, yeah. Yes. And even over in 1 Peter 3, where it talks about, is it verse 5 or 6? I tell you what, somebody turn over to 1 Peter 3 and read those two verses. I think it's 5 and 6. Yeah, so somebody says on the live stream, she must have aged well. Well, the biblical text tells us that she lived to be 100, I think it's 127. And the biblical text tells us on more than one occasion that she was a beautiful woman. So apparently she was still physically attractive at this point in time. Who's got that? 1 Peter 3, 5 and 6.
For after this manner in the old time, the holy women also, who trusted in God, adorned themselves, being in subjection to their own husbands, even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters ye are, as long as you do well, and are not afraid.
Listen to that, just kind of aside from Abraham and Sarah. With what did they adorn themselves? Because he in the first few verses he talks about it's not, the outward appearance is not what is of value to God. What does it say she adorned herself with there? Being in subjection. Okay. God and we've talked about this. We talked about this back in Genesis chapter 2 with the creation of the woman, this hierarchy that is set up. Christ is the head of Christ is God, the head of man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man. You have this structure that's been set up from the beginning. The adornment that, and even in that text it talks about a meek and quiet spirit, which in the sight of God is of great value. I'm reading a book for the second time around right now that I'm going to develop into some sermons here before too long. But it's about marriage, and one of the things that, so this couple that wrote this book, they wrote it together, they've been married for over 50 years and they have 9 children together. And one of the things that they talk about is compatibility, companionship. In one of their chapters, they have this thing called the 5 C's of, I think it's called the 5 C's of successful marriage. And part of it is interdependence in marriage. A lot of people, particularly young people in our culture, single young people in particular, and even within the church, want to find their independence first, and they have no desire for a mate. And it's interesting to be reading this book of independence. There's nothing wrong with being independent, but I think they were saying something like, by the time you get to be 40 or 45 years old, it gets awful lonely when it's just you. She was adorned with her. What's the Holy Spirit tells us there in 1 Peter 3 is that the adornment, the clothing that God values is the relationship between the husband and wife and the type of spirit that a person has. Now, there's nothing wrong with being physically attractive or physically attracted to your mate or your potential mate. Of course, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But when that becomes the standard of happiness, and we have to maintain that above the proper relationship between a husband and wife and the proper relationship between husband, wife, and God, well, we're emphasizing the wrong things. So anyway, back to what we were talking about here. She's, like I said, somebody was asking or mentioned on the live stream about Sarah. Obviously an attractive woman, but what the Bible emphasizes is her, I guess you'd say, her spirit, her mentality. And the same thing's true with husbands. We need to have because in verse 7 there in 1 Peter chapter 3, likewise husbands, see that you dwell with them according to knowledge. So giving honor unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel, as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. And so many people, you guys know this just as well as I do, have such a shallow view of what, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes a shallow view of what relationships are It's about status. It's about appearance. It's about things. And the biblical model for marriage, for relationships, is not anything like that. So, anyway, kind of went on a little rant there, but any questions or comments on anything we've said so far?
Abraham must have misread at least a couple of times here. We're talking about, especially here, as soon as Abimelech had this dream or whatever, and God talked to him, he was scared.
Sure.
And he was, in verse 11, surely in this country, you're not good people. You're going to
You don't fear God here. Yeah.
for this woman.
Yeah.
And he misread that very bad.
Seems to have. All right. Verse 6. I know that you did this in the integrity of your heart, innocence. There was no, from what God says there, it's like there's no malice, there's no evil intent here, so far as the text tells us. And that's why, number one, I withheld you from sinning against me. And number two, you didn't touch her, which would have been a sin against her and a sin against Abraham, right? Now, therefore, restore the man, his wife, for he is a prophet. And that's the first time this word is used in the Bible. And that's your next blank, actually. First time prophet is used in the Bible. This is interesting. He is a prophet, and he shall pray for thee, and thou shalt live. If you don't restore, you will die, and all that are yours. So there was, as Mr. Keith was just saying there was the fear of God, but was there the true fear of God before the communication from God? I don't know. But there certainly was afterwards, because he did what God told him to do. Abraham lied. This is verses 9 and 10. I like this. This is good to think about for us. He lied and needed some self-reflection. Somebody read verses 9 and 10 here. Yeah, what was your goal here? Well, his goal was self-preservation. I mean, we know that. And that's how he explains it there. I didn't think you feared God, and I thought you'd kill me and take my wife. And so, she is indeed my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. So, you have this, what I would call a bit of a lecture from Abimelech. Why would you do this to me? And, sometimes that's the best thing that can happen to us is somebody sits us down and sets us straight. We all need that sometimes. And so Abraham tried to justify his lie. You think about lying. I use that word up there, subterfuge. There's never a right time to lie. There's never a right time to lie. Yeah. Yeah. Well, anyway, it came to pass when God caused me to wander from my father's house that I said unto her, this is thy kindness which thou shalt show unto me at every place whither we come, wherever we travel and stop, because we've talked about this a bit, not much, but they're nomads. They're traveling all around. And so wherever we go, tell people you're my brother. Tell people you're my sister. So then Abimelech, it's kind of interesting to me, because he's the one that was lied to. He's the one whose life was in danger. And yet he took sheep and oxen, men servants and women servants, and gave them unto Abraham, and restored him Sarah his wife. And Abimelech said, behold, my land is before thee. Dwell, go wherever you want to, live wherever you want to. So, a bit of, I would say, self-reflection, which he needed. And so the next thing I put in here is, this should have been humiliating to Abraham. And to me, this is one of the one of the interesting things of the Bible is it doesn't, if the Bible is a man-made book and it's trying to present man in its best light, it does a bad job of that, doesn't it? Because it tells us, so Abraham is the friend of God. He's justified by faith. He's justified by works. He's the predecessor of all of us. Because if we are in Christ, then are we Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise, Galatians 3:29. And yet the Bible tells us of these events where he lies twice, and then he and Sarah together tried to have a son before the time appointed by God. And again, that's, if man wrote the Bible, he would try to present himself. If man was the sole source of Scripture, he would try to present himself in the best possible light. And he wouldn't tell all the bad stuff. I mean, we're pretty good at selling ourselves sometimes, aren't we? And how good we are, and leave out all the bad stuff. Because that doesn't help us any. The Bible doesn't do that. Any questions or comments on any of this? I have no idea. I mean, the way it just naturally reads, it seems to be like the kind of the way I envisioned it when I read it. It's like the next day, maybe. But I can't say that for sure. Doesn't seem very long.
After reading verse 13, do you think this happened more than twice?
It could be that it happened more than twice. Zach asked, looking at verse 13, could it have happened more than twice? Yeah, it could have. Yeah. Everywhere we go. Yeah. Could very well be. And it could very well be that they got used to doing that. True. Some interesting things to think about that the text doesn't answer. So, this should have been humiliating to Abraham. Abimelech did not act out of malice, so far as I can tell. Out of the integrity of my heart, I've done this thing. So, he suffered some type of ailment and then gave gifts to the man that lied to him. But he was told, this man's a prophet, and you do this thing right now, and he'll pray for you, and you'll be healed. So, he offered him all these gifts. And that's where, essentially, where this chapter ends. Abraham prays to God, and God healed Abimelech and his wife and his maidservants, and they bear children. So it seems that they were stricken, couldn't have children. So, as Miss Barbara was asking, what's the time frame? I don't know, but it seems like some time, a little bit length of time. For the Lord had fast closed up all the wounds of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. Which, again, he protected himself, but in doing this, both here and in Egypt, he kind of puts Sarah at risk, doesn't he? I mean, that's kind of one of the ways I look at it. Oh, yeah. They suffered for it too. No question about that. So, I guess that's kind of what I was hitting at. So, you've got chapter 12 and now chapter 20. You've got chapter 16. Why does the Bible tell us these two accounts about Abraham and Sarah? The two accounts, specifically 12 and 20. I know why they'd tell us about chapter 16, but it's just interesting to me to think, and I don't have a good answer for you, other than that to show Abraham and Sarah are human and are subject to the same fears and temptations that you and I are subject to today. They were not divine beings or anything like that. They were humans just like we are, and dealt with temptation and trials. You see them seeking out self-preservation in all three of these instances, including the Hagar and Ishmael instance. Sure. Yeah. We're not any different today in making mistakes. All right, chapter 21, the birth of Isaac. These first 7 verses. So I've got Hebrews 11, Romans 4. I don't think we'll turn over there and read those verses, but those 2 chapters talk, and particularly Romans 4, talk extensively about this particular event. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did unto Sarah as he had spoken. Not only that, you look at the end of verse 2, at the set time of which God had spoken. So you have the promises that are given, and so how much time now has passed from the original promise, as recorded in Genesis 12, to now Sarah conceiving with Abraham's son? You know how many years? He was 25. 75 when the promise was made. He is now 100 and she is 90. And so the text goes into those details a little bit here. Abraham called the name of the son which was born unto him, whom Sarah had borne, Isaac. What does Isaac mean? Laughter? I don't suppose you know why he's called laughter, do you? Because both Abraham and Sarah laughed at the idea of them having a child in their old age. He circumcised him at 8 days, which is according to the covenant that God made with Abraham back in Genesis chapter 17. This birth was prophesied initially in before that, but specifically in 1721. And they were both obviously beyond the age of being able to reproduce. When he names him, so verse 5 tells us that Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was. So you have here, this is miraculous. These are not natural occurring events, because even when the promise was made, Sarah, you remember what she said? What chapter was that in? Back in chapter 18, verses 10 to 13. After I have grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? It's going to be able to come to pass? Well, it comes to pass, and so here now, verse 6, 21:6, God has made me to laugh, so that all that hear will laugh with me. It's like not laugh of derision, but it's a laughter of fulfillment, a laughter of, you might say, joy. The promise has been fulfilled. Again, the birth has been prophesied, and you again here, just like with chapter 20, with the intervening of God with Abimelech, this is a miraculous intervention here, because she and Abraham both knew that they were beyond years to reproduce. And so, here we are. Who would have said unto Abraham that Sarah should have given children? The King James says, who would have said that Sarah should have given children suck? The New King James, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? There's an interesting thought there. It's kind of a side note, but how many children did Sarah have? 1. So we have these questions that come up sometime about the number and what the word children means. I'm thinking specifically in terms of the eldership. They must have children. You have 1 child and we're in a crowd and I say, how many of you in here have children? Those of you who have 1 child, what would you do? Would you raise your hand? You have children. So, anyway, just kind of a side note. It's interesting to note how the Bible uses words throughout and uses them throughout consistently. So the first 7, 8 verses talk about this miraculous event. Again, Hebrews 11, Romans chapter 4 are significant here. But then trouble comes up beginning in verse 8, and this trouble that comes up goes back in time by 10 years. No, I'm sorry, by 15 years. What is Ishmael doing when they're having a great feast for Isaac? Well, Ishmael, the King James says he is mocking. The New King James says he is scoffing. He's making fun of this little kid. And Sarah will have none of that. Why is this even an issue? Jealous, but why? Sarah initiated the whole thing. Take Hagar, we'll have a child by her. Here we are 15 years later, and trouble comes up. And this is so interesting because people go through a lot of things in life, and they get to certain points, perhaps a course of bad decisions gets them to this point, and they say, what in the world, why is God doing this to me? Without any concept of what did I do to myself to get me to this point. And that's really what we have here. She sees this, verse 9, and her response is, cast out this bondwoman and her son. Well, this is Abraham's son. Because Sarah had an idea. Because God had not acted within the time frame, I guess, that they thought he should have acted in. The son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac. And the thing was very grievous in Abraham's sight. Why? Because it's Abraham's son. Bad choices can pile up. And you may not have immediate consequences for your bad choices. But there will be consequences. You can guarantee that. What's the verse? Is it Exodus 32? Be sure that your sin will find you out. Somebody Google that little phrase there. Be sure that your sin will find you out. I want to think it's in Exodus chapter 32, but I could be wrong. See if you can find that for me. It's just a passage came to mind as we were, I guess as I was talking. You guys were listening to me talk. Be sure that your sin will find you out. Anyway, while somebody's looking for that, let me know when you get it, when you find it. Cast her out. Cast the son out. So you have his banishment. This is recorded down through verse 21. Numbers 32. Okay. Numbers 32, 23. All right, so you can write that down if you want to. Ishmael's approximately 15 years old at this time, looking back into chapter 16. These events are the result of bad decisions in the past. I put in here verse 13 is similar to 19 and verse 29. I will make a great nation of the son of the bondwoman because he is your seed. Well, the belief is, and I think there's some legitimacy to this belief, that the descendants of Ishmael became essentially what we know as the movement of Islam. They claim that for themselves, but it seems to be the prophecy that was made in regard to Ishmael and his birth, that his hand would be against all men and all men would be against him. It seems to be some interesting connections with what was said back in Genesis chapter 16 with him. But anyway, verse 12, Genesis 21:12, God said unto Abraham, let it not be grievous in thy sight because of the lad and because of thy bondwoman. And all that Sarah hath said unto thee, do what she said, for in Isaac shall thy seed be called, but I'm also going to make a great nation of Ishmael. And so that comes to pass. Paul uses this event to illustrate the difference between Judaism and Christianity. There's an allegory in Galatians 4, 21 to 31. The bondwoman and her son is representative of Mount Sinai and the law, and Sarah and the son of promise are representative of the New Jerusalem, who's the mother of us all. Freedom in Christ. As they are journeying, they run out of water. Hagar believes, I guess, that she and the child are going to die. The water's spent, verse 15. There's some implication there in verse 15 that she cast the child under one of the shrubs. Is he incapacitated? Whatever the case, I don't know. We're not given all the details, but she doesn't want to see the death of the child, verse 16. Well, God then comes to her and promises that he will survive and he will make him a great nation. Verse 18, she sees a well of water filled the bottle with water and gave the lad drink. And God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness and became an archer. Verse 20. So that's essentially where that account ends, down through verse 21. God makes that covenant with Ishmael. But then you have a reoccurrence here of Abimelech. He comes back into the story to end this chapter, verses 22 to 34. We get very little bit of time left here. It came to pass at that time that Abimelech and Phicol, the chief captain of his host, spoke unto Abraham, saying, God is with thee in all that thou doest. Now therefore swear unto me, here by God, that thou wilt not deal falsely with me, nor with my son or son's son, but according to the kindness that I have done unto thee, thou shalt do unto me and to the land wherein thou hast sojourned. So they make this covenant. There was some issue between Abraham and Abimelech's servants. They had taken away a well that belonged to Abraham. Seems they patched things up there. Abraham gives a gift to him. They made a covenant. And this region where they make this covenant is now known as Beersheba, which means the well of seven, or well of the seven. He presents him with let's see, what verse here? Verse 29, Abimelech said unto Abraham, what mean these 7 ewe lambs which thou hast set by themselves? Well, these are for you. It's a witness that this well belongs to me. And so they call the name of the place Beersheba. So these two then make a covenant. Just some interesting things that take place there. And again, there's not anything in Scripture about those specific events with Abimelech after this. It's just part of the historical narrative showing the journeys of Abraham and the difficulties, and some of those difficulties he brought on himself with his conduct. Any questions or comments on any of that? Okay. Appreciate your attention.